I've worked as a night appraiser at a pawn shop on the edge of town for a little over 5 years now, one of the few shops in our area that keeps late overnight hours specifically to serve the particular clientele who need quick cash outside normal business hours, shift workers, people in genuine financial emergencies, the occasional collector hoping to avoid the daytime crowd. It's specialized work, requiring a broad, practical knowledge of jewelry, electronics, musical instruments, tools, and the dozens of other categories of items people bring in, along with the harder-to-teach instinct for reading a transaction, knowing when someone's desperate, when someone's trying to pass off something stolen, when someone's simply an ordinary person having an ordinary rough month. I came to this job after a few years working retail jewelry sales, drawn by the appeal of quieter overnight hours and genuinely interesting, varied work that let me use the appraisal skills I'd built without the constant pressure of daytime sales quotas. I want to establish, before describing what I've experienced over the past year, that I'm not someone who came into this job predisposed to finding a quiet pawn shop unsettling after hours. 5 years of overnight work surrounded by shelves of other people's former possessions, guitars, power tools, wedding rings, old electronics, has never struck me as inherently strange. The specific hush of a retail space after the lights dim for the night, the faint smell of old leather and gun oil that never quite airs out of a shop like this, the occasional creak of the building settling. None of it, across most of my career here, ever registered as anything beyond the ordinary, specific atmosphere of this particular kind of work. Our shop tracks every single transaction through a detailed inventory and pawn ticket system, required both by our own business records and by state regulations that mandate detailed documentation of every item seller, including identification verification, for law enforcement purposes given how frequently pawn shops intersect with stolen property investigations. It's a thorough system I rely on constantly, cross-referencing every incoming item against recent theft reports our local police department shares with shops like ours, and its accuracy matters enormously both for our own legal compliance and for actually running an honest business. The item that changed my understanding of this job is a specific piece, an antique pocket watch, gold-toned though I've never confirmed whether it's actually gold or simply gold-plated, with an ornate engraved case and a faint, barely legible inscription on the inside cover that's worn too smooth over what must be decades of handling to fully read. It first came through our shop close to a year and a half ago, pawned by an elderly man I have no specific memory of beyond what our records show, a routine transaction like hundreds of others I process in any given month. The first time I noticed anything unusual was several months after that initial transaction, when the watch, having gone unclaimed and unredeemed past its holding period, moved into our regular sales inventory, was purchased by a customer, and then, to my genuine confusion, turned up again in our overnight pawn intake barely 6 weeks later, brought in by an entirely different person. A middle-aged woman according to our records, with no connection I could find to the original seller or the customer who'd purchased it from our sales floor. I remember cross-referencing the two names against each other out of simple professional curiosity, checking whether they might share an address, a family connection, anything that would explain the item passing between them in such a short window, and finding nothing at all linking them beyond the shared, unremarkable fact of both having walked into our shop. I want to be clear about why this initially struck me as odd rather than alarming. Items do sometimes cycle back through pawn shops multiple times, purchased and later pawned again by different owners as they change hands through gifts, resales, or simple bad luck. It wasn't the return itself that eventually became strange, but the pattern that emerged once I started paying closer attention, the watch cycling back into our shop roughly every 5 to 6 weeks, always pawned by someone new, someone with no traceable connection to any previous seller, and always, without exception, left unredeemed and unclaimed until it moved back into our sales inventory, only to be purchased again and return again on its own unsettling schedule. I brought this to my shop manager, a man named Delacruz who'd owned and run this pawn shop for going on 18 years, the following afternoon before my shift started, expecting a straightforward explanation involving some kind of local resale ring or a coincidence I simply hadn't recognized yet. Instead, he went quiet for a moment in a way that struck me immediately as different from his usual brisk, business-focused manner, and then asked me directly, "Is it the gold pocket watch?" I told him yes, and asked how he'd guessed. He was quiet again, longer this time, before telling me not to worry about it, that it happened periodically, that I should simply process the transactions normally and note the pattern in my own private records if I wanted to track it. I asked, more directly than I probably should have as a relatively established employee by that point, whether this had happened before I started working there. He told me yes, considerably more times than he'd like, going back further than his own 18 years, and that he'd explain more if it kept happening, but that for the moment, my job was simply to process each transaction according to our normal protocol. I did exactly what he asked, That first time and for the several months that followed, as the pattern repeated itself with the same unsettling regularity, the watch cycling through our shop roughly every 5 to 6 weeks, a different seller each time, always unclaimed, always eventually purchased by a new customer before cycling back in again. I found myself, during this stretch, developing an odd, unspoken habit of noting exactly where the watch sat in our display case whenever it was in our sales inventory, a small, private ritual that had no real practical purpose beyond satisfying my own growing need to keep some kind of personal record of its movements alongside the official transaction log Delacruz had access to. I never mentioned this habit to him directly, though I suspect, looking back, that he probably noticed and simply chose not to comment on it. The same quiet, respectful distance I imagine most people who've worked closely with this particular situation eventually learn to extend toward each other's individual coping mechanisms. That changed on a night about 8 months into my noticing this, when something happened that made it considerably harder to simply treat this as a strange but harmless business quirk. It was a slow Thursday, close to midnight, when a man came in to pawn the watch, and as I processed the transaction, following our standard identification verification procedure, I noticed something that struck me immediately as wrong. The identification he presented, a driver's license that appeared on its face, entirely legitimate, listed a name and photo that didn't match, in any respect I could discern, the man actually standing in front of me, though the license itself showed none of the visual tampering or alteration our training would normally teach us to watch for in a forged document. I ran the license through our standard verification scanner anyway, half expecting it to flag as invalid or altered, and instead watched it process as entirely legitimate, every security feature reading correctly, every database check returning a valid, unremarkable result, despite the plain, obvious mismatch sitting right in front of me between the photo and the actual person. I completed the transaction anyway, some instinct telling me, even before Delacruz had ever explained anything to me, that confronting the man directly wasn't the right move in that particular moment, and he left without incident, the watch safely logged into our overnight intake. I called Delacruz immediately once the man had left, even though it was well outside any reasonable hour, and told him everything, the mismatched identification, my growing unease about the entire pattern. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before. "I need you to come in early tomorrow, before your shift," he said. "I think it's time I actually explain this to you properly." When I arrived the following afternoon, Delacruz was waiting in the small back office, and he'd pulled out an old, worn ledger predating our shop's current computerized inventory system. He sat me down and began explaining a piece of this shop's history that went well beyond anything I'd understood about the job I'd been doing for the better part of a year. "This shop's been in my family since my father opened it decades ago," he told me. According to what he told me before he passed, there was an incident involving that specific watch, early in the shop's history, a customer who pawned it and never came back to redeem it, who was later found to have died shortly after that original transaction. Under circumstances my father never fully explained to me beyond saying they were troubling enough that he'd considered simply destroying the watch entirely rather than continuing to sell it. He didn't, obviously, and staff working here in the years since have periodically reported exactly what you've described, the watch cycling back through the shop on its own strange schedule, always through a different, seemingly unconnected seller. He paused, running his thumb along the worn edge of the old ledger. My father told me, once near the end of his own life, that he'd actually tried to have the watch appraised by an outside expert early on, hoping a professional opinion might explain something about its history or origin that could account for the pattern. He said the appraiser had spent a long time examining it, then handed it back without offering any formal written assessment at all, telling him only that some items were better left unexamined too closely, and refusing any payment for the consultation, which my father always found more unsettling than if the man had simply refused to look at it in the first place. I asked him what he actually believed was happening. He told me he genuinely didn't know, that in his 18 years running this shop, he'd never come to any firm conclusion beyond a strict, practical understanding of how to handle it. "There are really only a few rules," he said. "First, always process the transaction normally, accept the item, and never refuse it or draw attention to anything unusual, since in my father's understanding, refusing it seemed to correlate with worse outcomes than simply processing it as routine. Second, never attempt to keep the watch out of circulation yourself, don't set it aside, don't refuse to resell it once it's back in inventory, just let it move through the shop the way any ordinary item would. And third, if you ever notice something wrong with a seller's identification, the way you just did, don't confront them about it, simply complete the transaction and let them leave without incident." He paused, then added, quieter, "My father also told me never to research the watch's actual origin too aggressively, never to try tracking down exactly where it came from before that first documented pawn transaction here, decades ago. He never fully explained why, only that he'd started down that path himself once, early on, and had stopped after finding something in an old estate record that unsettled him enough to abandon the search entirely, something he never described to me in any further detail, no matter how many times I asked him about it over the years. I asked him whether he'd ever personally noticed anything else unusual about the sellers themselves, beyond the general pattern. He was quiet for a long moment. "Once," he said, "early in my own time running this shop, a seller came in late at night, and something about him struck me as wrong in a way I've never fully been able to articulate, a kind of stillness, an unnatural quality to how he held himself that I noticed but couldn't name. He answered every question I asked during the standard intake process appropriately, gave consistent, plausible answers, nothing that would have raised any formal red flag if I'd simply been reviewing a written transcript of the exchange afterward. It was something underneath the actual words, a specific wrongness in his timing, in the way his expression seemed to lag very slightly behind whatever he was actually saying, like watching a poorly synced recording. I processed the transaction anyway, following exactly what my father had taught me, and nothing happened beyond that unsettling impression. I've come to believe that simply completing the transaction, treating it as entirely routine no matter what I actually notice, is the reason nothing worse has ever happened in this shop across all the decades my family's run it. I left that conversation carrying a very different understanding of my job, and for the following months, I followed Delacruz's 3 rules exactly, processing each transaction normally, never trying to remove the watch from circulation, and staying professionally composed even on the 2 occasions I noticed further small inconsistencies in a seller's identification. I also did some digging of my own, searching old local records, and found a brief, decades-old newspaper mention of an unidentified man found deceased shortly after pawning several items at a local shop, the report carefully vague about further specifics in exactly the way I'd already come to recognize as typical of how these situations get documented. The article didn't name our shop directly, referring only to a local pawnbroker, but the general time frame and location matched closely enough with what Delacruz had already told me that I found it difficult to believe it referred to anywhere else. I searched further, hoping to find some follow-up coverage or a more complete account of what had actually happened to the man, and found nothing, the story apparently having faded from local interest within days of that single, brief mention, the same way so many of these old, carefully undocumented incidents seem to across every version of this pattern I've encountered. The incident that tested my own composure most directly happened almost 8 months after that conversation, on a night when a young woman brought the watch in, and during the standard appraisal process, as I turned the watch over in my hands under the counter's bright examination light, I noticed the faint inscription on its inside cover seemed, for just a moment, to shift slightly under the light, the worn, illegible lettering rearranging itself into something that looked, briefly, almost readable, before settling back into its usual indecipherable wear. I remember tilting the watch slightly, an instinctive, professional reflex any appraiser develops when trying to catch better light on a worn engraving, and the way the letters seemed to resolve, just at the edge of legibility, into something that might have been a name, or perhaps a short phrase, before dissolving back into the same smooth, illegible with the moment I tilted it back to check whether I'd actually seen what I thought I had. I want to be honest that I nearly said something in that moment, nearly broke Delacruz's rule about not drawing attention to anything unusual, some instinctive need to ask the young woman whether she'd noticed anything strange about the piece herself. I caught myself just in time, completed the appraisal and the transaction exactly the way I would for any ordinary item, and watched her leave without incident. I called Delacruz the following morning and told him what I'd seen, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's the first time I've heard of the inscription itself doing anything," he admitted. "I don't have a framework for understanding that, beyond wondering whether it means whatever's connected to that watch is somehow becoming more active, more willing to reveal itself in small ways it hasn't before. I think we should both be more careful going forward, though I'm not entirely sure what more careful actually looks like beyond what we're already doing." In the months since, I've maintained a considerably more careful, deliberate attention around that watch whenever it cycles back through the shop, and roughly 2 months ago, an incident occurred that added a genuinely unsettling new layer to everything I'd already pieced together. A regular customer, someone I'd known casually through years of legitimate, ordinary transactions, mentioned to me, entirely unprompted, that he'd purchased the watch from our sales floor once, years earlier, long before I'd started working here, and that he'd pawned it back to us within weeks, not because he'd needed the money, but because he'd started experiencing vivid, recurring dreams every night he kept it in his home, dreams he described only as involving a long, dark hallway lined with clocks, all of them stopped at different times, and a persistent, growing certainty within the dream that he needed to find one specific clock among them before something else did. He told me the dream had followed a consistent, escalating pattern each night, starting further back in the hallway each time, as though he were being drawn progressively deeper into it with every repetition, and that by the final night before he returned the watch, he'd woken convinced, with a clarity that frightened him more than the dream's actual imagery, that something else in that hallway had also been drawing closer, though he'd never once, in any of the dreams, actually seen it directly. I asked him, as carefully and casually as I could manage, whether he still remembered any other details about the dream. He told me only that the dreams had stopped entirely the moment he brought the watch back to our shop, and that he'd never told anyone about it before, mostly because it sounded, in his own words, too strange to say out loud to anyone who hadn't experienced something similar themselves. I told Delacruz about this conversation, and he admitted it was the first time he'd heard a customer describe anything beyond the transactional pattern itself, a detail he found considerably more unsettling than anything we'd documented up to that point, given that it suggested the watch's influence extended beyond simply its recurring, unexplained sales pattern into something that actually affected whoever happened to own it, even briefly. 3 weeks after that conversation, during a routine overnight shift, I experienced what I still consider the most unsettling single moment of my entire time working at this shop. The watch had cycled back in only 2 weeks earlier, unusually soon compared to its established 5 to 6 week rhythm, pawned by yet another unfamiliar seller, and that particular night, working alone in the shop after closing, going through routine inventory organization, I found myself, without quite meaning to, standing in front of the display case where the watch currently sat, staring at it for what felt, when I finally checked the clock, like nearly 20 minutes, considerably longer than I had any memory of actually intending to spend there. I remember, in the disoriented moment right after I finally checked the time, a specific unsettling sensation similar to waking abruptly from a nap you hadn't meant to take, the strange, disproportionate gap between how much time had actually passed and how little of it I could account for in my own memory. I don't have a clear account of what, if anything, I was thinking or experiencing during that stretch of time, only a vague, unsettling impression, similar to what the customer had described to me weeks earlier, of a long hallway, dim and lined with something I couldn't quite bring into focus, and a persistent, quiet sense that I was looking for something specific within it, though I had no clear idea what. I came back to full awareness abruptly, my hand pressed flat against the display case glass directly above the watch, with no memory of having moved there, my palm leaving a faint, warm impression on the cool glass that took several seconds longer to fade than I would have expected from such a brief, unconscious touch. I called Delacruz immediately, my voice unsteady enough that he asked, right away, whether I was actually all right. I told him everything, the missing time, the vague impression of the hallway, finding my own hand against the glass without remembering moving it there. He was quiet for a very long time before finally speaking. "I don't have anything in my own experience that matches that," he admitted. "Losing time like that, being drawn toward it without your own conscious awareness. I think, given everything else we've now documented, this is escalating in a way neither my father nor I ever fully anticipated when this was first explained to me. I want you to take some time away from working nights near that watch specifically, and I'll cover those shifts myself until we better understand what's actually happening." He was quiet again for a moment, then added, "I also want to apologize, genuinely, for not taking this more seriously sooner. I think some part of me had let the fact that nothing truly dangerous had ever happened, across all these decades, lull me into treating it with less caution than it apparently deserves. I don't want that same complacency to be the reason something happens to you." I told him I appreciated that, and that I didn't blame him for how any of this had been handled, given how little either of us actually had to go on beyond whatever fragments of institutional knowledge had survived across. However, many previous appraisers had quietly managed this same situation before either of us ever started working here. That conversation prompted me, in the days that followed, to ask Delacruz whether any of his previous night appraisers, before I'd taken the position, had ever left the job specifically because of the watch, or whether I was simply the first person he'd actually explained the full situation to. He told me there had been one appraiser, a woman named Halvorsen who'd worked the overnight shift for a few years before my own hiring, who he'd also eventually briefed once the pattern became impossible for her to ignore on her own, and who had, after that briefing, continued working the position for almost another year before finally requesting a transfer to daytime hours, citing, in her own words at the time, simple burnout from overnight work rather than anything specifically connected to the watch. Delacruz told me he'd always privately suspected there was more to her decision than she'd been willing to say directly, though he'd never pushed her on it, respecting whatever boundary she seemed to need around discussing it further. I asked whether he'd be willing to put me in touch with her, curious whether she might be willing to share anything more specific now that enough time had passed, and he agreed to ask, though he cautioned me not to expect much, given how firmly she'd always kept that particular door closed during her own remaining time at the shop. She did eventually agree to a brief phone conversation, cautious and clearly still uncomfortable discussing it even years removed from the job itself. She confirmed, in general terms, experiencing something similar to my own lost time incident, though she described it as happening to her on 2 separate occasions rather than just one, and told me that the second occurrence had been what actually pushed her to finally request the shift change, though she'd never told Delacruz the real reason at the time. Uncertain how to explain something she herself still didn't fully understand or trust her own memory of. She told me that in her own case, the missing time had run considerably longer than mine, closer to an hour by her own estimate, and that she'd never regained any memory at all of what had happened during that stretch, only the same disorienting confusion I'd experienced myself, finding herself in a different part of the shop than she remembered being in, with no clear sense of how she'd gotten there or what she'd been doing in the meantime. She also told me something she said she'd never shared with anyone else, including Delacruz, that in the weeks immediately following her second incident, she'd started noticing small, unexplained gaps in her own memory even at home, away from the shop entirely. Brief stretches of missing time that never lasted more than a few minutes, but that unsettled her considerably given how closely they seemed to echo what had happened to her at work. She said the gap stopped entirely within a month or so of her shift change, and that she'd never experienced anything like it since, a detail that left me sitting with my own phone for a long time after we hung up, wondering whether my own careful daytime accommodation would actually be enough to fully prevent something similar from eventually happening to me as well. I asked her, gently, whether she had any advice for me based on her own experience, and she was quiet for a long moment before telling me, simply, that she wished someone had told her to trust her own instinct to step away sooner rather than waiting as long as she had, and that she hoped, whatever I decided to do, I wouldn't make the same mistake of pushing through it longer than actually felt safe simply out of a sense of professional obligation to Delacruz or to the shop itself. Before we ended the call, she asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether the watch still had the same faint inscription she remembered from her own time handling it, and when I confirmed it did, she was quiet again, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped, before telling me that she'd always privately wondered whether that inscription would eventually become fully legible to someone, and that she was glad, in a strange way, that it apparently hadn't happened yet, though she couldn't fully explain why the thought of it finally resolving felt so specifically unsettling to her even now, years removed from ever having to think about it regularly. I've carried that particular exchange with me since, turning it over during the quiet stretches of my own daytime shifts, wondering whether Halvorson's instinct about the inscription eventually resolving connects, in some way neither of us has the information to fully understand, to whatever the customer's recurring dream was actually building toward, that persistent, growing certainty of needing to find one specific clock before something else did. I don't have any way of testing that connection, and I've mostly stopped trying, the same way I've stopped trying to make full, satisfying sense of most of what I now understand about this specific item. I followed that arrangement in the 2 months since, working exclusively daytime shifts whenever the watch's usual cycle approaches, while Delacruz personally covers the overnight hours during those windows, an accommodation that's required some genuine reshuffling of our shop's normal scheduling but that he's insisted on maintaining without complaint. I think often about the customer's dream, the long hallway lined with stopped clocks, and about my own brief, unsettling experience standing before that display case with no memory of the time that had actually passed. I think about Delacruz's father, and whatever he actually witnessed decades ago that led him to consider destroying the watch entirely rather than continuing to sell it, and I wonder, more than I probably should, what specifically stopped him from actually doing it, and whether he ever regretted that decision in his final years, or whether he'd made some kind of peace with it the same careful way Delacruz himself seems to have. I still work at this shop, going into my 6th year now, and I still follow Delacruz's original 3 rules exactly as he first explained them to me, processing every transaction normally, never trying to remove the watch from circulation, and staying professionally composed no matter what I notice about any given seller. The new accommodation, avoiding overnight proximity to the watch during its active cycle windows, has become simply another quiet, careful adjustment layered on top of everything else, the same kind of accumulated, informal vigilance I imagine has been building at this shop, one careful adjustment at a time, for as long as this pattern has actually been occurring, a slow, patient accretion of small, practical rules that none of us fully understand but that all of us, in our own turn, have chosen to trust anyway, simply because the alternative, testing the pattern directly to find out what actually happens if any of us stops following them, has never once struck any of us as a risk worth taking. Most nights, when the watch isn't due to cycle back through, my job feels exactly as ordinary as it always has, appraising guitars and jewelry and power tools, reading the quiet desperation or the simple bad luck in an ordinary customer's face, doing the honest, careful work this job has always required of me. But some nights, particularly as that 5 to 6 week mark approaches, I find myself glancing toward our display cases a little more often than the job strictly requires, watching for that specific gold-toned case among the ordinary jewelry and watches we keep there, and wondering, without ever quite letting the thought fully form, how many more times it's going to keep cycling through this shop, cellar after cellar, decade after decade, before whatever it's actually looking for within that dim, half-remembered hallway finally finds its way to someone who doesn't manage to look away in time. I think, too, about all the sellers who've brought it in over the years, the elderly man from my very first encounter with the pattern, the middle-aged woman, the man with the mismatched identification, the young woman whose visit prompted that unsettling shift in the inscription's lettering, none of whom I've ever been able to connect to each other in any way beyond their shared, unexplained willingness to walk into our shop and hand over an item that our own careful records show has never actually belonged to any of them for very long at all. I wonder whether they're aware, even briefly, of what they're actually carrying when they bring it through our doors, or whether, like the regular customer who finally told me about his own dreams years after the fact, they simply experience some vague, unsettling discomfort they can't fully name, one that resolves itself, quietly and completely, the moment they finally hand the watch across our counter and walk back out into the ordinary night. I've thought, more than once, about whether these sellers are somehow selected or drawn toward our shop specifically, some pattern beneath the pattern that neither Delacruz nor I has ever been positioned to fully understand, or whether it's simpler and considerably more unsettling than that the watch itself, wherever it happens to end up between our own recorded transactions, quietly ensures its own eventual return through means that don't actually require any deliberate selection at all. Any random person who happens to acquire it eventually finding themselves, for reasons they'd never think to question, walking back through our particular doors rather than any other shops. I don't have any way of testing that theory, and I've mostly stopped trying, the same way I've stopped trying to make full, satisfying sense of most of what I now understand about this specific item. Delacruz has mentioned, more than once during our now regular conversations about managing the situation, that he sometimes wonders what would happen if one of us simply refused the transaction outright, broke the rule his own father passed down to him decades ago, and actually told a seller no, we won't take that particular item, see what happens when the established pattern is genuinely, deliberately interrupted rather than simply carefully managed. Neither of us has ever seriously considered actually doing it, both of us far too aware, by now, of exactly how much careful, hard-won institutional knowledge stands behind the specific, unbroken discipline of simply accepting it, processing it, and letting it move on, decade after decade, the same quiet, patient rhythm that's apparently kept this shop and everyone who's worked in it reasonably safe for far longer than either of us has personally been alive. I've also begun keeping my own private notes about the entire situation, separate from anything official. In the same spirit, I imagine every previous appraiser at this shop must have eventually adopted once they'd learned enough to understand what they were actually managing. A quiet, informal record meant less for my own reference and more, I've come to realize, as something I might eventually need to pass along myself, to whoever Delacruz hires next if I ever move on from this position, or to his own eventual successor if the shop stays in his family the way it has for the 2 generations before him. I've thought, more than once, about reaching out to Halvorsen again, cautiously, to see whether she'd be willing to share anything further now that she knows I've genuinely experienced something similar myself rather than simply asking out of second-hand curiosity, though I've held back so far, not wanting to push her back into a conversation she'd clearly rather leave behind entirely. For now, all I can do, all Delacruz and I together can really do, is keep the shop running the way it always has, processing every transaction, ordinary and otherwise, with the same careful, professional composure this job has always demanded, and keep watching, quietly, for whatever comes through our doors next, on whatever schedule it's apparently always kept, patient, persistent, and, for now, still contained by nothing more than a small handful of careful, informal rules that neither of us has ever wanted to be the one to finally test.